The morning mist clung to the ancient oak trees surrounding Highgrove Manor like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their hold on the past. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell adjusted her collar against the October chill as she watched the black vehicles wind their way up the gravel drive. Behind her, a team of Royal Protection officers checked their equipment one final time, their faces stern with the weight of duty that had brought them to this moment. For months, whispers had circulated through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Staff members spoke in hushed tones about missing items from the late Queen's personal collection. At first, the rumors seemed too incredible to believe. After all, who would dare touch the monarch's most precious belongings? But as inventory after inventory came up short, the whispers grew louder, and the evidence became impossible to ignore. The sapphire star tiara had been the Queen's most treasured piece of jewelry, a gift from her late husband on their silver wedding anniversary. Unlike the crown jewels that belonged to the state, this tiara was the Queen's personal property, passed down through generations of royal women who had worn it only on the most sacred occasions. Its disappearance had sent shockwaves through the royal household that reached all the way to the highest levels of government. Sarah had been assigned to the case 3 weeks ago, when the palace finally acknowledged that what they had hoped was a simple misplacement was actually something far more serious. The investigation had led her through a maze of palace protocol, family tensions, and carefully guarded secrets that the royal family preferred to keep buried beneath centuries of tradition and propriety. The Queen Consort Camilla had been staying at her private estate for the past month, officially for rest and recuperation following what the palace had described as exhaustion from her royal duties. But Sarah's investigation had uncovered a different truth. Financial records showed significant debts that Camilla had been struggling to manage privately, debts that could easily be resolved by the sale of certain valuable items that might never be missed from the vast royal collection. As the convoy of official vehicles came to a stop in the circular drive, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. This was not just about recovering stolen property. This was about trust, betrayal, and the very foundation upon which the modern monarchy rested. The British public had slowly warmed to Camilla over the years, accepting her as Charles's queen after decades of controversy surrounding her role in the breakdown of his marriage to Princess Diana. But this scandal threatened to undo all of that carefully rebuilt reputation. The front door of the manor opened before Sarah could ring the bell. Camilla's private secretary, a thin woman named Margaret Pemberton, stood in the doorway with the practiced composure of someone who had spent decades managing royal crises. "Detective Inspector Mitchell," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "Her Majesty is expecting you in the drawing room." The interior of the manor reflected Camilla's personal taste rather than the formal grandeur of the official royal residences. Warm colors and comfortable furniture created an atmosphere that was more country home than palace. But the portraits on the walls and the obvious value of the decorative objects still spoke to the occupant's elevated status. Camilla was seated in a high-back chair near the fireplace when Sarah entered the drawing room. At 76, she still carried herself with the dignity that had been drilled into her during her years as a royal consort. But Sarah could see the strain around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she gestured for the detective to take a seat. "I suppose you've come about the tiara," Camilla said without preamble, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've been expecting this conversation for some time now." Sarah opened her notebook and studied the woman across from her. The Queen Consort had always been skilled at presenting a carefully controlled public face, but in the privacy of her own home, with the weight of investigation bearing down upon her, some of that composure seemed to be slipping. "Your Majesty, I need to ask you directly about the sapphire star tiara that belonged to the late Queen. Palace inventory shows that it was last seen in the private royal collection 6 months ago. Do you have any knowledge of its current whereabouts?" For a long moment, Camilla said nothing. She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance among the logs that crackled in the ornate fireplace. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to spend your entire adult life being judged by others? To have every decision questioned, every motive examined, every gesture interpreted as evidence of your character or lack thereof?" Sarah waited, recognizing that Camilla was choosing her words carefully. This was not the time for interruption or pressure tactics. Sometimes, the truth emerged best when given space to breathe. When Charles and I married, I knew there would be challenges. I knew that many people would never accept me, never forgive me for the role I played in the breakdown of his first marriage. But I thought that over time, through duty and service, I could prove myself worthy of the position I'd been given. Camilla stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where autumn was painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The financial pressures began almost immediately. People assume that being royal means unlimited wealth, but the reality is far more complicated. There are expectations, obligations, charities to support, staff to maintain, estates to keep running. And all of this on allowances that the Treasury watches very carefully. Sarah made careful notes as Camilla continued to speak. She had seen the financial records, the mounting debts that Camilla had been juggling for years. Credit card bills that ran into the tens of thousands, loans taken against future income, investments that had failed to produce the expected returns. The picture that emerged was of a woman trying to maintain an impossibly expensive lifestyle while lacking the personal fortune to support it. The late queen was always very particular about her jewelry, Camilla continued. Each piece had a story, a memory attached to it. She would tell me about the occasions when she had worn certain items, the people who had given them to her, the significance they held for the royal family. The sapphire star tiara was perhaps the most precious to her, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah could sense that Camilla was building toward something, preparing to reveal whatever truth had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, I was facing a crisis. Creditors were becoming increasingly aggressive in their demands for payment. I had exhausted all of my legitimate options for raising funds. I was desperate, and desperate people sometimes make choices they would never consider under normal circumstances. Camilla turned from the window to face Sarah directly. I took the tiara, not permanently, I told myself, just temporarily, until I could find another solution to my financial difficulties. I had it valued privately, and then I used it as collateral for a loan from a discreet private lender who specializes in such arrangements for high-profile clients. The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah felt a mixture of relief at finally having the truth and sadness at what it meant for everyone involved. The theft of royal property was serious enough, but the betrayal of trust made it infinitely worse. "Where's the tiara now?" Sarah asked. "In a safety deposit box in Geneva. I have the key, and I can arrange for its immediate return." The loan was structured so that I could reclaim the item at any time by repaying the principal plus interest. I had hoped to do so before anyone noticed it was missing. Before Sarah could respond, Margaret Pemberton appeared in the doorway. "Your Majesty, there are additional vehicles arriving. It appears to be a full royal protection detail." Through the window, Sarah could see more black cars pulling up the drive. This was no longer just a police investigation. The palace had decided to take direct action, sending the royal protection officers to ensure that the situation was resolved quickly and quietly. The next hour passed in a blur of carefully choreographed activity. Phone calls were made to Geneva, arrangements put in place for the immediate recovery of the tiara. Legal documents were prepared and signed, ensuring that the item would be returned to its rightful place in the royal collection without delay. But even as the practical matters were being addressed, Sarah could see the emotional toll that the situation was taking on everyone involved. Camilla sat in her chair like a woman who had aged a decade in a single day, the weight of her actions finally settling fully upon her shoulders. The staff moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of people in shock, struggling to process the reality of what their employer had done. As the afternoon wore on, word began to leak out despite the palace's efforts at containment. Royal correspondents started calling, seeking confirmation of rumors that were already spreading through London's media circles. The careful balance that the monarchy maintained between transparency and privacy was beginning to tip toward chaos. Sarah watched as Camilla's private secretary fielded call after call, each conversation more urgent than the last. The modern world did not allow for royal scandals to be managed in the slow, careful way that might have been possible in previous eras. Social media and 24-hour news cycles demanded immediate answers to questions that the palace was not yet prepared to address. "What happens now?" Camilla asked when the official business had been concluded and the royal protection officers were preparing for their return to London. Sarah closed her notebook and looked at the woman who had just confessed to one of the most significant thefts in recent royal history. "That will depend on many factors, Your Majesty." The palace will need to decide how to handle the matter publicly. The Crown Prosecution Service will need to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. And you will need to face the consequences of your actions. As Sarah prepared to leave, she found herself thinking about the complexity of the situation. This was not a simple case of greed or criminal intent. It was a story of pressure, desperation, and the impossible standards that public figures were expected to maintain regardless of their personal circumstances. The drive back to London took her through the countryside that had been home to British royalty for centuries. Ancient castles dotted the landscape, silent witnesses to generations of royal drama that had played out behind palace walls. Some scandals had destroyed reputations and ended reigns. Others had been weathered and eventually forgotten. Only time would tell which category this latest crisis would fall into. But as the city lights began to appear on the horizon, Sarah knew that one thing was certain. The royal family would never be quite the same again. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired, and the theft of the Queen's most precious tiara had created fractures that would take years to heal. The story was far from over. In fact, Sarah realized as her phone began buzzing with messages from her superiors, it was only just beginning. 7. The emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace convened at dawn the following morning. In the blue drawing room, beneath portraits of monarchs past, King Charles III sat at the head of a mahogany table that had witnessed countless royal crises over the centuries. His face bore the weight of a man who had awakened to find his world fundamentally altered overnight. Around the table sat the key figures who would determine how the monarchy would navigate this unprecedented scandal. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, shuffled through briefing papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades managing royal catastrophes. Across from him, Dame Rebecca Harrison, the palace's director of communications, stared at her laptop screen where news alerts continued to ping with alarming frequency. The story broke on social media 20 minutes ago, Rebecca announced, her voice tight with controlled tension. A palace staff member leaked it to a gossip blog, and it's already being picked up by the major news networks. We have perhaps 30 minutes before this becomes a full international story. Charles rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure that had plagued him since childhood whenever family scandals threatened to overshadow royal duty. At 75, he had hoped that his reign would be remembered for his environmental advocacy and modernization of the monarchy, not for his wife's theft of his mother's jewelry. "What are our options?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the limited range of responses available to them. Sir Clive cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, we have 3 potential approaches. We can deny everything and hope that without concrete proof, the story will fade. We can acknowledge that there was a misunderstanding regarding the tiara's location, but characterize it as an administrative error. Or we can be completely transparent about what occurred and hope that honesty will limit the long-term damage to the crown's reputation." Prince William entered the room at that moment, still wearing the casual clothes he had thrown on after being awakened by an urgent phone call from his father. At 43, the heir apparent had developed a keen understanding of how royal scandals could spiral out of control if not managed properly. His own mother's experiences had taught him the devastating power of negative media coverage when it reached a critical mass. "The children are asking questions," William said without preamble as he took his seat. "Charlotte saw something on her friend's phone about grandmother's tiara. We need to move quickly before this affects the entire family." Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had remained at their home with the children, but William carried with him the concerns of a new generation of royals who would inherit whatever remained of the monarchy's reputation after this crisis had run its course. Dame Rebecca looked up from her screen with increasing alarm. "The story is gaining momentum faster than we anticipated. #royal theft is already trending globally, and several European tabloids are running headlines about stolen crown jewels. We're getting requests for comment from news organizations in 43 countries." The modern royal family had spent decades carefully rebuilding public trust after the tumultuous 1990s that had seen the breakdown of multiple royal marriages and the death of Princess Diana. Charles's own relationship with Camilla had been gradually accepted by the British public, but that acceptance had always been fragile, built on years of careful public relations work and Camilla's dedication to her royal duties. "Where's Camilla now?" William asked, voicing the question that everyone in the room had been carefully avoiding. "She's returned to Clarence House," Sir Clive replied. "She's requested a private meeting with your Majesty, but Given the circumstances, we've advised that any communication be handled through official channels for the time being. The suggestion that the king should not meet privately with his own wife spoke to the gravity of the situation. In the carefully regulated world of royal protocol, even personal relationships became matters of state when scandal threatened the institution of the monarchy. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens where tourists were already gathering despite the early hour. "She told me last night that she was drowning," he said quietly. "The debts, the pressure, the constant scrutiny. She said she felt like she was letting everyone down, including me." The admission created an uncomfortable silence in the room. Royal marriages were expected to be partnerships that strengthened the monarchy, not sources of division that created constitutional crises. But Charles's love for Camilla had been the defining emotional narrative of his adult life, and the idea of abandoning her now seemed almost impossible for him to contemplate. "Your Majesty," Dame Rebecca said gently, "public opinion polling is already showing significant negative reaction. Preliminary surveys indicate that 67% of respondents believe that Camilla should be stripped of her royal titles. That number could increase substantially if the story continues to dominate news cycles." Prince William leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave. "Father, I understand the personal difficulty of this situation, but we have to consider the impact on the institution. The monarchy survived the 1990s because we learned to put duty before personal considerations. This situation requires the same approach." The weight of royal history pressed down upon everyone in the room. Monarchs had abdicated for love, queens had been executed for treason, and entire dynasties had fallen when personal failings undermined public trust. The British monarchy had endured for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances and, when necessary, sacrificing individuals to preserve the institution. Sir Clive opened a leather folder and withdrew a document that had been prepared during the night by the palace's legal team. "We have drafted several possible statements, ranging from full support for the Queen Consort to a more measured response that emphasizes the palace's cooperation with the investigation while maintaining appropriate distance from the allegations." Before anyone could examine the proposed statements, a knock at the door interrupted the meeting. A junior secretary entered with obvious reluctance, carrying a message that she clearly wished she did not have to deliver. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've just received word that Swiss authorities have confirmed the recovery of the tiara from a Geneva bank. The story is being reported by Reuters, and photographs of the tiara are already circulating online." The physical evidence of Camilla's confession had now become public knowledge, eliminating any possibility that the palace could characterize the situation as a misunderstanding or administrative error. The theft was real, documented, and now impossible to deny or minimize. Dame Rebecca's laptop chimed with another urgent notification. "The Prime Minister's office is requesting an immediate briefing on the situation. Downing Street wants to understand the potential constitutional implications before making any public statements." The involvement of the government elevated the crisis beyond a simple family scandal. As head of state, the king's personal difficulties had the potential to affect Britain's international relationships and the stability of the Commonwealth realms that still recognize the British monarch as their sovereign. "What about the other Commonwealth countries?" William asked. "Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they've all been through Republican movements in recent decades. This could reignite those debates." Sir Clive nodded gravely. "Initial reports suggest that Republican politicians in several countries are already using this situation to question whether the monarchy remains relevant in a modern world. We could be facing a constitutional crisis that extends far beyond Britain's borders." Charles returned to his seat, looking every one of his 75 years. "Schedule a private meeting with Camilla for this afternoon," he said finally. "Whatever decisions need to be made about her future role, I need to hear her explanation directly before we proceed." "Your Majesty," Sir Clive protested gently, "such a meeting could be interpreted as the palace attempting to coordinate stories or obstruct the investigation." "Then, we'll ensure that Detective Inspector Mitchell is present as an observer," Charles replied firmly. "But I will not abandon my wife without understanding exactly how we reached this point." The loyalty Charles showed to Camilla had been one of his defining characteristics throughout their relationship, but it had also been a source of ongoing controversy. Many Britons still remembered the pain that Diana had endured during Charles's affair with Camilla, and the idea that the king would continue to support his wife after she had stolen from his late mother seemed to many observers like a betrayal of both Diana's memory and the queen's legacy. Dame Rebecca's phone buzzed with yet another urgent message. The Archbishop of Canterbury's office has called. The church is concerned about the theological implications of a crowned queen consort being involved in theft. There are questions about whether Camilla can continue to participate in religious ceremonies if she's facing criminal charges. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity to the crisis. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, the king was expected to uphold the highest moral standards, and, by extension, so was his consort. The Archbishop's concerns reflected broader questions about whether the royal family could continue to serve as moral exemplars for the nation if they could not maintain basic ethical standards within their own household. Prince William's phone rang, and he stepped away from the table to take the call. When he returned, his expression was even more serious than before. "That was the Canadian High Commissioner," he reported. "The Prime Minister of Canada is convening an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss whether this situation affects Canada's relationship with the Crown. They're particularly concerned about upcoming state visits and Commonwealth ceremonies." The international ramifications of Camilla's actions were beginning to cascade beyond anything the palace had initially anticipated. Royal tours that had been planned months in advance might need to be canceled or restructured. State ceremonies involving the queen consort might become diplomatic embarrassments rather than celebrations of international friendship. Sir Clive opened his folder again and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "There's one more option we haven't discussed," he said carefully. "Precedent exists for royal consorts to relinquish their titles voluntarily when their continued presence becomes detrimental to the monarchy." The suggestion hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room understood that Sir Clive was diplomatically raising the possibility that Camilla might need to step down from her royal role entirely, either temporarily or permanently. Charles's reaction was immediate and sharp. "That is not an option," he said firmly. "Camilla made a serious mistake, and she will face the consequences of her actions through the proper legal channels. But I will not abandon the woman I love because it might be politically convenient to do so." The king's declaration of loyalty to his wife was both admirable and potentially catastrophic for the monarchy. Public opinion polls had already shown declining support for Camilla specifically, and Charles's refusal to consider distancing himself from her could extend that negative sentiment to his own reign. "Your Majesty," Prince William said carefully, "perhaps we should consider a temporary step back for Camilla while the legal situation is resolved. It wouldn't need to be permanent, but it might allow some of the immediate pressure to dissipate." The suggestion that his own son was advising him to distance himself from his wife clearly pained Charles. The king had waited decades to marry the woman he loved, enduring years of separation and public criticism. The idea of being forced apart again by scandal seemed almost unbearable to him. Dame Rebecca looked up from her laptop with yet another urgent update. "Social media sentiment is becoming increasingly hostile. We're seeing calls for Camilla's arrest, demands for her to be stripped of all royal privileges, and some particularly unpleasant speculation about her motivations. The longer we wait to respond officially, the more the narrative is being controlled by our critics." As the morning progressed, the crisis continued to evolve and expand in ways that the palace's crisis management protocols had never anticipated. This was not just a personal scandal or a minor breach of protocol. It was a fundamental challenge to the monarchy's credibility that threatened to undermine everything the royal family had worked to rebuild since the dark days of the 1990s. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine not just Camilla's future, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The afternoon meeting between King Charles and Camilla took place in the king's private study at Clarence House, a room that had witnessed countless intimate conversations during their decades-long relationship. But today, the familiar space felt charged with tension as Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell sat discreetly in the corner, her presence serving as a reminder that this was no longer simply a marital discussion, but part of an ongoing criminal investigation. Camilla entered the room wearing a simple black dress, her usually perfectly styled hair pulled back in a way that made her look older and more vulnerable than her public appearances typically revealed. She had not slept the previous night, and the strain of the past 24 hours was etched clearly across her face. Charles rose from his chair as she approached, and, for a moment, They simply looked at each other across the space that seemed to represent the vast chasm that had opened between them. Then, in a gesture that spoke to their long history together, he stepped forward and took her hands in his. "Tell me how it came to this," he said quietly, his voice heavy with pain and confusion. Camilla's composure, which had held throughout the official proceedings of the previous day, finally began to crack. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, tears beginning to form her eyes. "It started as such a small thing, just a temporary solution to buy some time. I thought I could make it right before anyone noticed." She moved to the window, looking out over the London street, where photographers had already begun to gather despite the palace's efforts to keep the meeting private. "Do you remember what it was like in those early years after we married? The constant criticism, the comparisons to Diana, the feeling that I would never be good enough for the British people?" Charles nodded, his own memories of those difficult years still painful. The public had eventually accepted Camilla, but it had taken nearly 2 decades of careful image management and dedicated service to the crown. "I thought I'd finally found my place," Camilla continued. "The public seemed to have accepted me. I was contributing meaningfully to the royal duties, and we were happy. But the financial pressure never stopped. Every charity I supported needed donations. Every event required a new outfit. Every public appearance came with costs that seemed to multiply endlessly." Detective Inspector Mitchell made careful notes as Camilla spoke, documenting the emotional confession that was unfolding before her. This was far more than a simple admission of guilt. It was a window into the hidden pressures and impossible expectations that shaped royal life behind the public facade. "The investment advisor convinced me that I could double my money in 6 months," Camilla said, her voice barely audible. "Cryptocurrency," he said. "Revolutionary technology that was going to transform everything. I invested my entire savings, money I'd been setting aside for years to cover the constant expenses." Charles closed his eyes, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "You lost it all. Worse than lost it." The advisor disappeared, and I discovered that what I thought was a legitimate investment was actually some kind of fraud. Not only was my money gone, but I owed taxes on gains that had never actually existed. Suddenly, I was facing debts that were 10 times larger than anything I had ever dealt with before. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of traffic outside and the distant clicking of camera shutters as media crews continued to gather on the street. The royal protection officers had cordoned off the immediate area, but they could not stop the growing crowd of reporters and curious onlookers who sensed that history was unfolding behind the elegant facade of Clarence House. "Why didn't you come to me?" Charles asked, the hurt evident in his voice. "Why didn't you tell me what was happening?" Camilla turned from the window to face her husband directly. "Because you had already sacrificed so much for me. Your relationship with William was strained for years because of our marriage. The public criticized every decision you made to support me. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming even more of a burden." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, reflecting years of carrying the weight of knowing that her presence in Charles's life had come at a significant cost to his relationships and his reputation. The guilt she felt had clearly been compounding over time, creating a psychological pressure that had pushed her toward increasingly desperate solutions. "Besides," she added with bitter irony, "what was I supposed to say? That the queen consort had been taken in by a cryptocurrency scammer, like some naive pensioner?" The humiliation was almost as difficult to bear as the debt itself. Detective Inspector Mitchell spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Your Majesty, can you walk us through the specific decision to take the tiara? How did you know where it was kept? And how did you access it?" Camilla returned to her chair, sitting carefully as if the weight of her actions was physically pressing down upon her. "The late queen had shown me her private collection several times over the years. She was proud of the pieces, especially the ones with personal significance. The sapphire star tiara was kept in a special case in her private safe, separate from the official crown jewels." She paused, clearly struggling with the memory of what she had done. "After her death, when Charles inherited her personal effects, the combination to the safe was shared with both of us. It was meant to be a gesture of trust, an acknowledgement that I was now truly part of the family." The irony was devastating. The late queen's final gesture of acceptance toward the woman who had married her son had inadvertently provided the means for one of the most serious breaches of royal trust in modern history. "I told myself I was borrowing it, not stealing it," Camilla continued. "I researched discreet lenders who dealt with high-value collateral, people who understood the need for absolute confidentiality. The plan was to repay the loan within 3 months and return the tiara to its proper place before the next formal inventory. Charles stood and began pacing the room, his agitation growing as he fully grasped the scope of his wife's deception. 3 months, Camilla? You thought you could keep this secret for 3 months while continuing to participate in royal duties as if nothing had happened. I was desperate, she replied, her voice rising slightly. The creditors were threatening legal action that would have become public. Can you imagine the headlines if it had been revealed that the queen consort was being sued for unpaid debts? At least this way, I thought I could solve the problem privately. The knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sir Clive Alderton entered with obvious reluctance, carrying a folder that everyone in the room sensed contained unwelcome news. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but there have been significant developments that require immediate attention. Charles gestured for his private secretary to continue, though his expression suggested that he was not sure how much more bad news he could absorb in a single day. The Swiss bank has confirmed that the tiara was used as collateral for a loan of £2.3 million, Sir Clive reported. The lender has agreed to return the item immediately upon repayment of the principal plus 6 months of interest, which brings the total to approximately £2.8 million. The figure hung in the air like a physical blow. Even for someone with royal resources, nearly £3 million represented a substantial sum, particularly given that it would need to be paid immediately to secure the tiara's return. Additionally, Sir Clive continued, the Crown Prosecution Service has indicated that they are considering formal charges. Theft of royal property is treated extremely seriously under British law, and the value of the item involved puts this case into the category of grand theft, which carries significant potential penalties. Camilla's face had gone completely pale. The reality of facing criminal prosecution was something she had clearly not fully considered when she made the decision to take the tiara. The thought of a member of the royal family standing trial for theft was unprecedented and would create a constitutional crisis that could reverberate for generations. What are my options? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Inspector Mitchell consulted her notes before responding. Your Majesty, cooperation with the investigation and full restitution would certainly be viewed favorably by the court. However, the decision about formal charges ultimately rests with the Crown Prosecution Service, and they must consider factors beyond just the wishes of the royal family. The irony of the Crown prosecuting the Queen Consort was not lost on anyone in the room. The legal system that operated in the name of the monarchy would now be called upon to hold one of its highest representatives accountable for serious criminal behavior. Sir Clive opened his folder and withdrew several documents. The palace has prepared a preliminary statement acknowledging the situation and emphasizing Your Majesty's cooperation with the investigation. However, public reaction will likely be severe regardless of how we frame the announcement. Before anyone could respond, the sound of shouting from the street below drew their attention to the windows. The crowd of reporters had grown substantially, and news helicopters were now circling overhead. The story had clearly reached a new level of international attention. Charles moved to the window and looked down at the scene below. Dozens of camera crews lined the street, and protesters have begun to gather carrying signs calling for Camilla's resignation and for the monarchy to be abolished entirely. The scandal was already being used by Republican groups as evidence that the royal family was fundamentally corrupt and unworthy of their privileged position. This isn't just about us anymore, Charles said heavily. This is about the future of the monarchy itself. The weight of institutional responsibility that had been drilled into Charles from birth was now in direct conflict with his personal loyalty to his wife. As king, he had a duty to protect the crown from scandal and preserve it for future generations. As a husband, he felt an equally strong obligation to support the woman he loved during the most difficult period of her life. Camilla stood and joined him at the window, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to witness what might be the beginning of the end of her royal career. I've destroyed everything, haven't I? She said quietly. Not everything, Charles replied, taking her hand. But it will take time to understand what can be rebuilt and what is permanently broken. As the afternoon shadows grew longer across the room, the 3 occupants sat in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts about how a moment of financial desperation had escalated into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of one of the world's oldest monarchies. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and the questions being shouted by reporters became increasingly pointed and hostile. The royal protection officers worked to maintain order, but the sense that events were spiraling beyond anyone's control was becoming impossible to ignore. The story was about to enter its most dangerous phase, where public opinion would begin to crystallize and determine whether this scandal would be survived or whether it would mark the beginning of the end for Charles and Camilla's reign. The emergency session of Parliament was called for the following morning, as the constitutional implications of the royal scandal became impossible to ignore. In the House of Commons, MPs from all parties gathered to debate whether the monarchy could continue to function effectively with a queen consort facing potential criminal charges for theft. Prime Minister Catherine Walsh stood at the dispatch box, her expression grave as she prepared to address the most serious constitutional crisis to face Britain in decades. Behind her, government ministers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while across the chamber, opposition leaders sensed an opportunity to attack both the government and the monarchy. Mr. Speaker, the situation that has developed regarding Her Majesty the Queen Consort requires this House to consider fundamental questions about the role of the Crown in modern Britain. The Prime Minister began, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was addressing. In the gallery above, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell watched the proceedings with fascination and concern. The criminal investigation she had initiated was now driving political events that could reshape the relationship between the British people and their ancient monarchy. The leader of the opposition, Marcus Thompson, rose from his seat with the barely contained excitement of a politician who sensed that history might be turning in his favor. Mr. Speaker, this scandal demonstrates exactly why Britain needs to move beyond the outdated institution of monarchy. How can we expect our citizens to respect the law when those who claim to rule by divine right consider themselves above it? The intervention drew cheers from Republican MPs and uncomfortable silence from the government benches. For years, support for the monarchy had been declining among younger Britons, and this scandal provided concrete evidence for those who argued that hereditary privilege was incompatible with modern democratic values. Meanwhile, in the privacy of Windsor Castle, the royal family was holding its own crisis meeting. Prince William sat across from his father in the oak drawing room, while Princess Anne participated via video conference from Scotland, where she was carrying out royal duties that had become increasingly difficult to focus on as the scandal dominated global news coverage. The palace switchboard has been overwhelmed with calls, Princess Anne reported from screen. 90% are demanding that Camilla be stripped of all royal titles immediately. The Scottish National Party is already using this situation to argue for independence, claiming that Scotland should not be represented by a corrupt monarchy. The implications for the United Kingdom's political unity added another dimension to the crisis. The monarchy had long served as one of the unifying symbols that held together England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. If that institution lost credibility, it could accelerate the forces of nationalism that threatened to tear the country apart. Prince William leaned forward in his chair, his expression more serious than his father had ever seen it. "Father, I've been thinking about this all night, and I believe we need to consider the long-term consequences for George, Charlotte, and Louis. They will inherit whatever remains of the monarchy after this crisis passes. Do we have a right to leave them with an institution that has been fundamentally damaged by our decisions?" The reference to the next generation struck Charles deeply. His own childhood had been shaped by royal scandals and controversies, and he had hoped that his reign would provide stability for his grandchildren. Instead, his marriage had become the source of the very kind of crisis he had wanted to avoid. "What are you suggesting?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew where his son's thoughts were leading. "I'm suggesting that sometimes protecting the institution requires difficult personal sacrifices," William replied carefully. "History will judge us based on whether we put duty before personal considerations when the monarchy was threatened." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Dame Rebecca Harrison at Buckingham Palace. The Director of Communications appeared on a video screen, her usually composed demeanor showing obvious strain. "Your Majesty, we have a problem," she announced without preamble. The Swiss authorities have confirmed that this wasn't the first time the tiara was used as collateral. Financial records show that it was pledged against loans on 3 separate occasions over the past year, suggesting a pattern of behavior rather than a single desperate act. The revelation hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident driven by temporary financial pressure now looked like systematic fraud carried out over an extended period. "There's more," Dame Rebecca continued. "The private lender in Geneva has released a statement claiming that Her Majesty represented herself as the legal owner of the tiara, not merely someone with access to it. If that's accurate, it suggests deliberate deception rather than a panicked mistake." King Charles felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around him. Each new revelation made Camilla's actions appear more calculated and less forgivable, undermining his ability to defend her behavior as an understandable response to overwhelming pressure. Princess Anne's voice came through the video connection with characteristic directness. "Charles, I understand your personal loyalty to Camilla, but we can no longer treat this as a private family matter. The institution of monarchy is bigger than any individual, including members of our own family." The words echoed similar conversations that had taken place during previous royal crises, when personal feelings had been forced to give way to institutional necessity. The royal family had survived for centuries by understanding that the crown was more important than any single person who wore it. Back in the House of Commons, the debate was becoming increasingly heated as MPs from all parties struggled to address the unprecedented nature of the situation. Constitutional experts who had been hastily summoned to provide guidance admitted that there were no clear precedents for dealing with criminal accusations against a reigning queen consort. "The fundamental issue," declared Professor Margaret Blackwood from Oxford University's Constitutional Law Department, "is that the queen consort derives her authority entirely from her marriage to the king. If her actions have compromised her moral authority, it raises questions about whether she can continue to fulfill the ceremonial and symbolic functions that define her role." The legal complexities were staggering. Unlike the king himself, who enjoyed certain legal immunities by virtue of his constitutional position, the queen consort was subject to the same laws as any other British citizen. However, prosecuting her would create practical problems that no one had ever anticipated. In Geneva, meanwhile, international media crews had gathered outside the bank where the tiara had been stored, turning the discreet financial institution into an unwilling symbol of royal scandal. Swiss authorities, usually protective of their banking secrecy laws, found themselves cooperating with British investigators under intense international pressure. The bank's president, Dr. Andreas Müller, held an uncomfortable press conference in which he defended his institution's procedures while acknowledging that they had been manipulated by someone claiming royal authority. "We followed all standard protocols for high-value collateral," Dr. Müller explained to the assembled reporters. The documentation provided appeared to be legitimate, and the client's identity was verified through multiple independent sources. "We had no reason to question the transaction's legitimacy." The Swiss investigation had uncovered a sophisticated scheme involving forged documents and false representations that painted Camilla's actions in an even more damaging light. This was not the desperate act of a woman overwhelmed by debt, but a carefully planned fraud that had taken months to execute. Back in London, Camilla had retreated to a small apartment in Belgravia that she had maintained privately throughout her marriage to Charles. The modest flat, which she had purchased decades earlier during her first marriage, now served as a refuge from the media storm that had made her normal royal residences impossible to occupy. She sat alone in the living room, surrounded by newspapers and magazines that carried her photograph on every front page. The headlines grew more devastating with each edition: "Royal Thief," "Crown Criminal," "The Queen Consort's Betrayal." Public opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy had dropped to historic lows, with many respondents indicating that they had lost faith in the institution entirely. A soft knock at the door interrupted her solitude. Margaret Pemberton, her loyal private secretary, entered carrying a stack of resignation letters that had arrived throughout the day. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I thought you should see these," Margaret said quietly. "Staff members from across the royal household are submitting their resignations. They feel that their continued association with the situation compromises their professional reputations." The defection of long-serving royal employees, people who had dedicated their careers to supporting the monarchy, represented perhaps the most devastating blow of all. These were individuals who understood better than anyone the importance of loyalty and duty and their decision to abandon Camilla spoke to how profoundly she had damaged the institution they served. "How many?" Camilla asked, though she dreaded the answer. 37 so far, including several senior household officials who have served the family for decades. The number represented a hemorrhaging of institutional knowledge and experience that would take years to replace. More importantly, it demonstrated that even those closest to the royal family viewed Camilla's actions as unforgivable breaches of trust. As evening fell over London, emergency meetings continued at the highest levels of government and within the royal household. Constitutional lawyers worked through the night to develop options for addressing a crisis that threatened to destabilize not just the monarchy, but Britain's entire system of government. In quiet conversations held in secure rooms across Westminster and Buckingham Palace, the unthinkable was beginning to be discussed, whether King Charles might need to choose between his throne and his wife. The scandal that had begun with a simple theft was evolving into a constitutional crisis that could reshape Britain for generations to come. The decisions made in the next 24 hours would determine whether the thousand-year-old monarchy could survive the betrayal of one of its most trusted members. As the night deepened, the lights burned late in government offices and royal residences across London, as the most powerful people in Britain struggled to find a way forward through the greatest crisis the monarchy had faced since the abdication of King Edward VIII nearly a century earlier. The final act of the crisis began at dawn on a gray November morning, 3 weeks after Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had first arrived at Highgrove Manor. The intervening days had seen a steady deterioration in public support for the monarchy, with daily protests outside royal residences and growing calls from politicians across the political spectrum for fundamental constitutional reform. King Charles stood at the window of his private study at Buckingham Palace, watching the crowds that had gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. The protesters carried signs demanding everything from Camilla's imprisonment to the complete abolition of the monarchy. The sight of his own people calling for the end of an institution that had been his life's work filled him with a profound sadness that seemed to age him visibly with each passing day. Behind him, the emergency session of the Privy Council was preparing to convene. The ancient body of advisors, which included former prime ministers, senior judges, and church leaders, had been called together to provide counsel on a situation that none of them had ever imagined they would face. Sir Clive Alderton entered the room, carrying a leather folder that contained the documents that would determine the monarchy's future. "Your Majesty, the Privy Council is assembled. They're waiting for your decision on how to proceed." Charles turned from the window, his face bearing the weight of a man who had been forced to choose between his heart and his duty. The past weeks had brought revelation after revelation about the extent of Camilla's deception, each new discovery making her position more untenable and his own reign more precarious. The investigation had uncovered not just the theft of the tiara, but a complex web of financial impropriety that stretched back years. Camilla had systematically abused her access to royal collections, using various pieces as collateral for loans that she had never intended to repay. The total value of her theft now exceeded £10 million, making this the most serious financial crime in the monarchy's modern history. "What are the recommendations from the constitutional experts?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew what advice they would offer. "Unanimous, Your Majesty," Sir Clive replied quietly. "They believe that the Queen Consort's continued presence in her role poses an existential threat to the monarchy. Public trust has eroded to the point where the institution itself is in jeopardy." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Charles had known for days that this moment would come, but hearing it stated so directly still felt like a physical blow. In another wing of the palace, Prince William was meeting with his own advisors, including senior members of Parliament, who would play crucial roles in determining how the monarchy would be restructured in the aftermath of the scandal. The heir apparent had spent sleepless nights considering the inheritance he would one day receive, wondering whether there would be anything left of the crown's authority and prestige by the time it passed him. "The polling data is devastating," reported Dame Julia Hartwell, the government's chief constitutional advisor. "Support for the monarchy has fallen below 30% for the first time in recorded history. More troubling, support among young people has virtually disappeared. We're seeing the real possibility of Britain becoming a republic within the next generation." The implications extended far beyond Britain's borders. The Commonwealth realms were holding emergency sessions to consider whether they could continue to recognize a monarchy that had been so thoroughly discredited. Australia's Prime Minister had already announced plans for a new referendum on republicanism, while Canada's Parliament was debating a motion to sever constitutional ties with the British Crown. What about Camilla herself? William asked. Has she indicated any willingness to step aside voluntarily? Dame Julia shook her head. Her legal advisors are counseling her to fight all charges and maintain her innocence. They believe that admitting wrongdoing at this point would guarantee imprisonment and complete disgrace. She seems convinced that she can weather this crisis if the king continues to support her. The tragedy of Camilla's position was that her refusal to accept responsibility for her actions was making the situation worse with each passing day. Her continued presence in royal ceremonies and official functions serve as a constant reminder of the scandal, preventing any possibility that public anger might begin to subside. In the Houses of Parliament, an emergency debate was reaching its climax. The Prime Minister stood to address the nation's constitutional crisis, her words being broadcast live to a global audience that was watching to see whether one of the world's oldest monarchies could survive its greatest internal threat. Mr. Speaker, the government has received formal advice from the Crown Prosecution Service that criminal charges will be filed against Her Majesty the Queen Consort, the Prime Minister announced, her words sending shockwaves through the chamber and around the world. The charges, which included grand theft, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud, carried potential prison sentences that could see a member of the royal family behind bars for the first time in modern history. The constitutional implications were staggering, as no one had ever determined what would happen to the monarchy if the king's consort was imprisoned. Back at Buckingham Palace, the meeting of the Privy Council had reached its moment of decision. The ancient chamber, which had witnessed centuries of royal crises, felt heavy with the weight of history as Charles prepared to address the assembled advisors. My lords and ladies, the king began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to announce. We are gathered to address the gravest crisis to face the crown in living memory. The actions of my wife have brought shame upon the institution of monarchy and betrayed the trust that the British people have placed in our family for generations. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant sound of protesters outside the palace walls. Charles looked around the room, faces that reflected a mixture of sympathy, disappointment, and resignation. After careful consideration of all advice presented to me, and after consulting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and my heir, I have reached a painful but necessary decision. Charles paused, gathering the strength to speak words that would forever change his life and his reign. Her Majesty the Queen Consort will immediately relinquish all royal titles and privileges. She will cease to participate in any official royal functions and will surrender all access to royal properties and collections. This separation is not temporary, but permanent and irrevocable. The announcement marked the effective end of Camilla's role as Queen Consort, though their marriage would continue. Charles had chosen to save the monarchy by sacrificing his wife's position within it, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. Sir Clive Alderton formally read the statement that would be released to the media. His Majesty the King announces with deep regret that the Queen Consort has voluntarily relinquished her royal titles and will no longer participate in official duties. This decision reflects Her former Majesty's desire to spare the crown further embarrassment and to allow the monarchy to begin the process of rebuilding public trust. The fiction that Camilla's departure was voluntary was maintained to preserve some dignity for all involved, but no one in the room was under any illusion about what had actually occurred. The king had been forced to choose between his wife and his crown, and duty had ultimately prevailed over love. In the weeks that followed, the process of rebuilding began slowly and painfully. Camilla was quietly relocated to a private residence in the countryside. Effectively exiled from the royal world she had worked so hard to join. The criminal proceedings against her would continue, but away from the public eye that had once celebrated her as queen. King Charles appeared before television cameras for the first time since the crisis began, looking older and more careworn than the British people had ever seen him. His statement to the nation was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the pain that the scandal had caused while pledging to dedicate his remaining years to restoring the monarchy's reputation. I ask for your forgiveness, he said, his voice breaking slightly. The institution of monarchy is bigger than any individual, including myself. We will earn back your trust through our actions, not our words. Public opinion polls showed a slight uptick in support for the monarchy following Camilla's departure, suggesting that Charles's decisive action had prevented the complete collapse of the institution. However, the damage was severe and long-lasting. Republican sentiment remained high, and future historians would mark this scandal as the beginning of the monarchy's final decline. Prince William and Catherine stepped forward to take on additional royal duties, presenting a younger and more relatable face for the monarchy as it struggled to remain relevant in an increasingly democratic world. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, would grow up knowing that their destiny had been forever altered by the choices of their step-grandmother. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell closed her files on the case 6 months later, as Camilla was sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended provided she repaid the full amount of her theft and performed significant community service. The suspended sentence allowed her to avoid jail, but her fall from queen consort to convicted criminal was complete. The sapphire star tiara was returned to its place in the royal collection, but it would never again be worn by a queen consort. Charles had decreed that it should remain permanently on display as a reminder of the price of betraying the public trust. As the years passed, the scandal became a defining moment in British constitutional history, studied by scholars as an example of how quickly centuries-old institutions could be brought to the brink of collapse by individual actions. The monarchy survived, but in a diminished form that reflected the harsh realities of governing in an age where accountability and transparency were demanded even from those who claimed to rule by divine right. Charles ruled for the remainder of his life with the burden of knowing that his greatest personal happiness had come at the cost of his institutional legacy. The love story that had defined his adult life had ended in betrayal and exile, a reminder that even kings must sometimes choose duty over their hearts. The tale of the stolen tiara became a cautionary story about the corrupting influence of unchecked privilege and the fragility of public trust. It marked the end of an era when royalty could expect automatic deference, and the beginning of a new age where even monarchs were held accountable for their actions and those of their families. In the end, the theft of a single piece of jewelry had changed the course of British history, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of personal betrayal can have the most profound consequences for the institutions that govern nations.